A man walks into a bar. He takes his usual seat alongside a row of familiar faces. They're sharing stories, joking, laughing. But the man decides to take the spotlight with a story of his own. He silences everyone before revealing, "Hey, you know, I played in the NFL." After the laughter died down, he reiterated himself. "No, really, I did." And the craziest part is, he wasn't lying. The man was Jack Dolly Gray. At least that's the name we go with. And all those fake people fake laughing in a bar that doesn't really exist, well, that might not be too far off how it looked in reality. See, Jack Gray was a football player at Princeton. A pretty good one, actually, earning All-American honors in 1922. He even scored all 3 of the team's touchdowns in their biggest game of the year, a comeback thriller against Chicago, which also happened to be the first nationwide radio broadcast of a football game. This is still thought of as one of the greatest college games ever, and led the Princeton team to being coined the Team of Destiny after they stormed back for the win. The Tigers went undefeated that season, retroactively being named national champions by most selectors. So any player from this squad was a hot commodity, but their star All-American left end, that's a top talent in the country. And about 1,000 miles westward, in St. Louis, another man just happened to be putting together a football team. Jack went and pitched himself to this promising brand new squad, and with his resume, it didn't take too much convincing. Jack Gray easily talked himself into a starting end spot on the St. Louis Allstars. It was 1923. The Allstars were set to join a ragtag 3-year-old group that had just changed its name to the National Football League. Things were looking good. Except that's not exactly the whole story. I lied about a couple things, mainly that things were not looking good. The St. Louis Allstars were not a promising football team, and that is not at all Jack Dolly Gray, because Jack Dolly Gray does not exist. That's not a real person. Allow me to explain. The best way to start piecing together this story is to just tell you how Dolly Gray's NFL career went, and it lasted less than 1 year. Of course, he was put in the starting lineup right away, and everyone was excited to see what the college star could do. The St. Louis Allstars started out with an exhibition against a team from small-town Illinois, and they killed them, 25-0. Then, the real NFL season began, with a scoreless tie week 1 against the Green Bay Packers. That was fairly common in the early NFL, a fact proven in week 2 with another scoreless tie. And week 3, finally some points on the board, but for the other team, a 6-0 loss. You could say the St. Louis Allstars leaned on their defense, but it was really more terrible offense all around than anything else good happening on the other side of the ball. However, by now, the alarm bells were absolutely ringing over Dolly Gray. You see, through these 3 games, Gray had played horribly. Not like a rough slump he was going through. It looked like a middle schooler somehow stumbled out there with the pro athletes on accident. I'm talking such bad football that the All-Stars coach, the man who gave Gray a shot, came to the conclusion that he had been tricked by someone pretending to be the star Princeton football player, a complete imposter. And somehow, he was correct. That guy was not Jack Dolly Gray, the famous Princeton end. It was just some random dude who had stolen the college star's identity and got on an NFL roster with no paperwork or verification necessary, and no one realized. Now, the St. Louis Allstars coach, a man named Oli Cay, who also owned and played on the team, could have just accepted. He walked the prank. He got duped, tricked, whatever. Cut this phony off your team and move on. But he got a different idea. An idea that takes this from a weird 100-year-old story of stolen identity to a hilariously unbelievable sequence of events that perfectly captures the dysfunction and pure lunacy of the early NFL. You see, being a first-year startup football team in the 1920s was not exactly lucrative. The NFL was struggling to make any money as a league, and each team kinda had to fight for their own lives to stay afloat. A number of franchises came and went, folded after just a couple years, sometimes just a couple games. So, Oli Cay, of course, wanted to keep his team running as best he could. He just wasn't flush with cash. But you know who did have some spare change is the Green Bay Packers, who were kinda trying to change their name at the time, but that wouldn't end up working. The Packers weren't flailing quite as hard, and more importantly, they had no idea that Oli Cay was a completely useless imposter. In their eyes, Gray was still a year removed All-American and one of the best players on St. Louis. Even though the teams had played each other a couple weeks ago, that was an ugly game. His poor play could be written off without being a huge red flag. Sure, he didn't do anything, but no one did, and it's not like Green Bay was already watching him closely with skepticism like Oli Cay likely was by then. So, Cray made the deal. He knowingly sent the talentless average Jack over to Green Bay in exchange for some much-needed cash to help keep the St. Louis Allstars running. Exactly how much money the deal was for is unknown, but it wouldn't end up mattering much anyways. See, this here is a 1923 Wisconsin newspaper. They excitedly announced that the Packers landed Jack Dolly Gray, one of the best football players in the country, just for some cash. Hell yeah, great deal. Here's from another paper. They wrote 3 whole paragraphs about the guy, referenced the 3-touchdown Chicago game, and said his coach at Princeton called him one of the best players he ever saw. So, once again, Dolly was instantly thrust into a starting end spot on an NFL team. His first game with the Packers was against fellow Wisconsin team, the Racine Legion, which the Packers played horribly in and were blown out. Even worse, their new star player presumably played just awful football today because the Packers coach quickly realized something was off. It was that obvious. Of course, this doesn't surprise us, but remember, it would have been a real gut punch to the Packers. This clearly wasn't the guy they traded for, and they were not happy. Luckily, the next game on the schedule was a rematch with the St. Louis Allstars, who Green Bay felt owed them some answer. Now, the Packers coach was football demigod Curly Lambeau, and his plan was to confront Oli Cay about the trade. Specifically, why did Jack Dolly suck at football? But as the Packers team boarded the train to St. Louis, everyone was there. Then, all of a sudden, someone was gone. It was Dolly. He was missing. The Packers arrived in St. Louis, still no sign of him. And that's it. No one ever saw Jack Dolly Gray again. After playing just one game with the Packers, the man disappeared from the team train and vanished off the face of the earth, never seen, heard from, or identified ever again. The Packers and Allstars played their game like normal, another riveting contest, and after the matchup, Curly did question Oli about the trade and asked what the hell was going on. Now he was just more confused than anything else. And at that point, Oli came clean and told him the whole story, how he figured out it was an imposter, not the real Jack Gray, and wanted to play the same trick on someone else. But Oli framed the whole thing as a joke. He said it was just a prank on his good buddy Curly. He ended up giving the Packers their money back and insisted that was his plan all along, just having some fun. Well, the real truth is unknown. It's heavily speculated that Oli Cay was lying here and only pulled out the "it was all a joke" card once he was caught. I'll let you guys come to your own conclusion on that, but do remember that Oli and the St. Louis Allstars were beyond desperate for cash, and the money received was quote-unquote much needed to even get them through the season. But props to Oli, he did give the money back, and it was possibly at the cost of keeping his football team. The Allstars finished the season having lost over $6,000 and folded after this first year. Again, we don't know exactly how much money the Dolly Gray deal was worth, but it couldn't have helped the St. Louis football team that their coach's focus was at least partly on a multi-week well-layered ruse that profited his team 0 players and $0. Also, yeah, scoreless ties weren't insanely rare, but the team scored no points in 6 out of their 7 matchups this year. That's not going to put fans in the stands. Cray took his team to even smaller town Illinois for one last exhibition game where they suffered an embarrassing loss that put the franchise to sleep for good. So, who was Jack Dolly Gray? Who was really the imposter, his true identity? Short answer, we don't know. No idea, no leads or anything, and I don't want to get any hopes up. We're not solving the mystery in this video. But we can connect some dots. You see, Jack Dolly Gray doesn't exist. He wasn't even a Princeton football player, and no one scored 3 touchdowns in the famous Princeton vs. Chicago game that year, despite many newspapers making that claim. But that game did happen. It was real, and there was a man who did exist named Howard Gray, who went by the nickname Howdy. That is whose face this is. Now, Howdy Gray was on that 1922 Princeton team, and he was a real All-American end for them. And in that Chicago game, Howdy Gray did score 1 touchdown, just not 3. Now, the real Howard Gray is an official and very documented person, famous college player, and went on to become a respected surgeon. You can find lots of info on him, but he never played any professional football. So most people can agree that the unknown imposter was trying to steal the identity of Howdy Gray and somehow misquoted it as Dolly. Amazingly, and this really says more about the state of the NFL at the time than anything else, no one caught this mistake, and I guess the last name Gray was just enough to convince the few people paying attention that this must be that Princeton All-American kid. Keep in mind, college football was much more popular than the NFL at the time, so while a lot of people across the country probably knew Howdy Gray from Princeton, there weren't many who were also keeping up with the NFL close enough to connect the dots. He probably told some reporter that he scored 3 touchdowns against Chicago in that big game last year, and I guess that too was not fact-checked very hard, just ran with, and other newspapers followed suit. But whoever the trickster was, he timed his escape very deliberately. He realized the 2 coaches would likely compare notes and end the charade. No more undeserving NFL playing time, no more Dolly Gray. He got the hell out of it. As for his true identity, that's a cold case that seems just about unsolvable at this point. The Dolly Gray mystery, as it's known, would be almost impossible to piece together today. Whoever the trickster was is long deceased by now. His kids would more than likely be dead if he had any. A unique and perfectly executed all-time hoax. Similar to D.B. Cooper, this stunt was so successful that we can only refer to the perp as the likely false name associated with the case, because there's nothing else to go on. He left no trace. It's not very well known at all, and partly because of that, we've never even had a real suspect for who did it. Very few people have ever heard of this story. There's like less than 10 articles about it on the internet right now. A lot of what you just heard was almost entirely lost to time. Some of this stuff probably hasn't been seen in decades. And I'm just trying to preserve great sports stories like this so that doesn't happen. So just to give you guys all the information possible, I'll unload the rest of the info I have on the whole case. Firstly, the St. Louis Allstars were a shoddy mishmash of unverified guys who just wanted to play some pro football. There was ironically a lack of all-star talent for the team, and Oli Cay was later quoted saying there were some who pretended to be All-Americans from the East just to get a chance to play. Obviously, he's talking about Dolly, but he infers there's more than one. It's just Dolly Gray is the only known concrete example of a liar from the team. To his credit though, Cray did land a couple real legit football players, including All-American Dick King and All-Conference player Ed Brick Travis, both of whose names could be made into penis jokes if you try hard enough. But the two-headed monster wasn't enough to save the St. Louis Allstars. As we know, the team would fold for good after its first and only season in the NFL, causing this story to really be more associated with the Packers franchise in modern times just because they exist. Not to worry, the football club in St. Louis was the beginning of a complicated relationship between the sport and city that would feature plenty more weird stories to call their own. And in all my research, the only names I have even seen mentioned or brought up as to who done it were by sports writer Bob Carroll, who's sort of the father of this mystery. Bob told the story decades ago in the 80s and provided a ton of the key information I used. I consider his write-up on the mystery to be the best one out there. Now, before he unearthed it, I personally cannot find any single piece of media talking about this story. No one at the time reported there being an imposter caught pretending to be Howdy Gray. So I would absolutely love to know where he found it and the many details that were seemingly never reported before him, but unfortunately Carroll passed away in 2009. The best he could hypothesize was two professional athletes at the time, whose real names were actually Dolly Gray. It's a pretty flimsy argument, because who would use their own name when lying about their identity? And it gets worse when you look into it and realize one of them was a 44-year-old baseball player in 1923, and the other died of tuberculosis just a couple years later. So, while I can't in good conscience put anyone's name out there, there's just no evidence to do so, I'll pin it down as much as possible. First of all, I'm thinking our guy was a younger athletic male. We know this because he at least passed the eye test of being an All-American college football player. We'll say 18 to 26 years old. Next, we're looking for some sort of connection to Princeton University or maybe even to Howard Gray directly. I say this because the imposter not only knew who Gray was, but was confident enough to try and steal his identity, meaning he probably knew that the real Howdy Gray wasn't going to play in the NFL, or he would have been risking getting caught right away. And finally, I'm gonna say we were dealing with an educated or at least literate person. I know he misquoted Howdy's name, but I'm thinking it was a lot of planning and reading various things to not only make this work, find the right guy, but also to get out when he did and never get caught, get away with it all. It may seem redundant to say this, but in the 1920s, narrowing it down to only people who can read cuts out about 30% of the US population, so it's worth mentioning. And that's who we're looking for. Throw in that they've probably been dead for a while and we're on our way to pinning him down. I urge you to reach out to me if you have any information that could lead to his capture, and for any possible sightings, I've set up a special number you can call 24/7 if you spot someone who matches the description of Jack Dolly Gray. Unfortunately, the reward of 7 nickels has remained constant since 1923. But who knows? This could all be wrong. It could have been some dumb dude who got a drunk idea, acted on it, and it somehow worked. You really can't underestimate how janky the NFL was. Nothing is out of question. Whoever it was, the man we call Jack Dolly Gray, the guy who wrongfully played in the NFL through one of the best executed tricks in league history, well, we really only know one thing for certain about him. He had one hell of a story to tell his buddies. Thank you.